In this class we're going to look at the quantity theory of money and look at how it attempts to explain the phenomenon of inflation, how it tries to explain how inflation comes about. We can trace back the origins of this theory way back into the classical economists and even to some philosophers who became interested in the area, David Hume for example. So it goes right back probably into the late 1700s, but we can trace it through the 1800s certainly. Adam Smith in 1776 in The Wealth of Nations, but coming forward it permeates a lot of thinking right up to the time when so-called neoclassical economics started, which grew out of the classical tradition, and also with the advent of Keynesian economics from 1936 onwards. So it changed. It became less popular with the advent of Keynesianism from 1936, when John Maynard Keynes wrote his book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money. But before that, it certainly held sway. Now, its ideas were that relative prices are flexible in the economy, and they're also constantly adjusting to bring about full employment. So if there wasn't full employment, then that was due to rigidities, let's say in the labour market. Let's say wages were too high and they were fixed too high. That would mean that there was little demand for labour and an excess supply of labour. A lot of people would want work because wages were so high, but few employers would want labourers because the wages were so high again. So if wages were not allowed to adjust upwards and downwards, then there would be inflexibility, and that could lead to unemployment. So it's flexibility in prices that was central to the classical view, allowing the market mechanism to work, in other words. Of course, the issue I just mentioned about, say, higher wages, that's very controversial because people resist a cut in wages. They don't like it, quite naturally. But also some economists later considered that a cut in wages would be counterproductive, because then people would have less money to spend and there would be less demand for goods and services, and hence less demand for labour. So it gets into a very contorted series of arguments. And as far as we're concerned in this class, what we're going to do is simply say the classical view saw relative prices as flexible and the economy constantly adjusting to full employment. That's the classical view. Prices are all flexible and the economy is moving towards full employment as a consequence. They saw the general price level as being determined by the quantity of money circulating in the economy. So the general price level was a function of the amount of money circulating in the economy. But relative prices, one against the other, was down to individual markets adjusting. Individual markets, the price in some markets rising, in some markets falling. But the general price level, that was determined by the amount of money in the economy. Now, the Fisher equation of exchange was developed by Irving Fisher in 1911, and it has become a popular way of explaining the relationship between money and inflation, and was subsequently used, as we'll see later, into the 1970s as an explanation for inflation, and it underpinned the ideas behind monetarism, which was diametrically opposed, of course, to Keynesianism. Now, the Fisher equation is made up from four variables as follows. M is the money supply within the economy. It's the amount of money in the economy, M. V is called the velocity of circulation of money. We'll talk about it again in a moment, but just to say something about it here, it's the number of times a unit of money is used. It's the velocity of circulation. It's the amount of time that a unit of money is used to transact. P is an index of all prices in the economy. That means raw materials, semi-finished goods, finished goods, all prices. And T is the number of transactions in the economy. The total number of transactions in the economy. Now let's have a few words about V. V is the velocity of circulation of money, as I said. It's the average number of times a unit of currency will change hands in a given time period. For example, if V equals 3, then on average a unit of currency, for example a £10 note, will be used 3 times in a given time period, say for example in a week. So if V was equal to 3, then in our case here the £10 note would be used 3 times. Somebody would take the £10 note, spend it, so someone else would receive it. They in turn would take the £10 note and spend it, so someone else receives it, and they would, and so on. So it would be used 3 times. In this case, the £10 note will purchase goods and services worth £30. It was used 3 times. Now, P is the average price level. It applies to all goods and services, as I said earlier, including final goods and services, intermediate goods and services, raw materials. It may be considered as a drawback, since in general the consumer is only interested in the price of final goods and services. By and large, we're only interested in what we have to pay. We don't much care about what the producers had to pay or what raw materials cost or whatever. We know they're important, but really what we're interested in is how much do we have to pay when we get to the checkout, when we get to the till. So it's an average price level of all the items, and that's what's meant by P in the Fisher equation. T is the total number of transactions in the economy in a given time period. It includes all transactions, intermediate and final. So raw materials being traded, semi-finished goods and so on, all of those are transactions and they'll all be included in the Fisher equation. So it includes all goods and services and the price of all goods and services. The Fisher equation may now be cast as follows. Now, the value of money spent, MV, in other words, that the value of the money spent, it's the amount of money times the number of times we use the money. So let's take a very simple example. Let's say the government only issued £10. And we know in fact it's billions and billions, but let's say it's just £10 and we use the £10 3 times. That's the value of the money in the economy. So if we take the amount of money the government issues, or the monetary authorities issue, let's say in the case of the UK, the Bank of England, what the Bank of England issues, M, and we multiply it by the velocity of circulation, the number of times we use the money, that must equal the value of money received, which is the number of transactions times the price level. So in other words, the two sides here are equal. MV, well, it's identical to PT. If I spend £10 in your shop, you receive £10. My expenditure is equal to your receipt. So the amount of money that we spend is the amount of money received. MV and PT are identical. Therefore, MV must equal PT. If the money supply, let's say, is 10 and the velocity of circulation of money is equal to 3, the average price level, let's say, is 5, then the total number of transactions must be 6. If you just substitute those in there, you'll see that's correct. MV, 10 times 3, which is 30. PT, 5 times 6, which is 30. The expression MV is equal to the value of money spent in a given time period. So it's, let's say, 10 times 3, which is equal to 30. The expression PT is equal to the value of receipts in the given time period. In the example, there are 6 transactions which take place at an average price of 5. So PT equals 5 times 6, which is 30. In other words, our expenditure is equal to someone else's receipts, which must be the case. That's the only way the money can go. If I spend it, someone else receives it. My expenditure must be matched by someone else's receipts. Now, the amount that the consumer spends, MV, must be the same as the amount producers receive, PT. In fact, they're one and the same. They're identical. One person's expenditure is another person's receipt. This being the case, MV must be identical to PT. They're identical. They're exactly the same. Now, since MV must be identical to PT, the Fisher relationship is not an equation, it's an identity. So in fact, we talk about the Fisher equation, but really it's an identity. We've got the wrong name. MV equals PT is an equation. Mathematically, an equation is only true for certain values. For example, a quadratic equation is only soluble with 2 solutions. It's only got 2 solutions. So it's not true for the whole range of values. It's only true for two values. So MV equals PT is an equation only if it is true for certain values. If M equals 10, V equals 3, and P equals 5, then T must equal 6. So if we know 3 of the values, then the 4th value is determined. Now, since MV is identical to PT, the relationship should be written as like this. It's got 3 little lines, not equals. 3 lines is stronger. These two are identical. They are the same. They're true for all values. All values of MV must equal all values of PT. However, we call it an equation. So we'll stick with the term, the Fisher equation. But really we should be talking about the Fisher identity. But so be it. So we'll talk about the Fisher equation. Now, let's look at this. Let's start with the top one here. MV equals PT. Let's say V and T are constants. In other words, we put little lines on top to say they're constant, they're fixed. Now, if V and T are fixed, therefore, delta M, I'll just put the cursor onto the screen for a moment. Here, delta M leads to delta P. So, V and T are constants. So any change in M must lead to a change in P. For example, if the government or some designated monetary authority, like, say, for example, the Bank of England in the UK, if the government, say, increases the money supply by 5%, then inflation will increase by 5%, because the money supply has gone up. Delta M, the change in M, the little triangle is known as delta, delta M leads to delta P, change in P. So, if the money supply increases by 5%, then P will increase by 5%. In other words, inflation will increase by 5%. So the equation suggests that the way to fight inflation is to control the money supply. So if a government has got high rates of inflation, the way to fight it is by reducing the money supply. delta M leads to delta P. Now the importance of this relationship was popularized by the monetarist economists in the 1970s. It was particularly advocated by the so-called Chicago School and the Nobel laureate Milton Friedman. So Milton Friedman made a lot about trying to control the money supply and letting markets work, and the control of the money supply would then control the, if you like, the macroeconomy, would control the rate of inflation. Individual markets would work, and if providing the individual markets were not constrained, providing they were allowed to work, they would lead to full employment. Very similar to the classical position. However, the relationship posed a problem. How exactly does a change does change in M lead to a change in P? So exactly what's the mechanism? What causes the change in M to lead to a change in P? You see, mathematically it's fine. We had the Fisher equation. We held V and T, velocity of circulation of money, and T, the total number of transactions. We held those constant. And if we do, we get a change in M leads to a change in P. That's straightforward. What causes it exactly? What's the economics behind this? Well, this introduced what's known as the black box methodology. Here, a change in M, somehow something happens, it's in a black box, we don't know what happens, and out pops a change in P, a change in inflation. So let's say the money supply increases, inflation will go up. Why does it go up? Well, it just does. It happens inside the black box, and we don't know what happens in the black box. It's a black box. However, Friedman appealed to the evidence. He provided detailed statistical evidence from the United States and the UK, and also Israel, I think, to show that changes in the money supply led to changes in prices. So if you look at the figures over a long period of time, when the money supply increased, there was a lag, and then prices would rise. There was a time period, and then prices would rise. When the money supply was constrained, there was a lag, but then inflation would fall. So prices, or inflation if you like, was linked to the money supply. He was not concerned with causation. When the money supply changed, then prices changed in the same direction, and why that happened did not really concern the monetarists. The fact is, it always happened. So it's the black box methodology. It works. The evidence suggests it works. Why it works? Well, it just works. So it became known as the black box methodology. Now I'm simplifying this like crazy, but this seems to be the logic of the position that was taken. Later on, a much more sophisticated explanation was offered by Friedman. We want to explain why money supply, changes in the money supply, changes the rates of inflation. Well, a simple explanation could be this portfolio explanation. For example, households and companies have portfolios of assets. For example, for households, this may include furniture, the house, car, some money, shares, the clothing the people have got, perhaps some gold, rings, jewellery, and so on. So there's a portfolio. The households have a portfolio of assets. Companies also have portfolios of assets. They have raw materials and equipment and premises and so on. So they've got portfolios of assets. So given we've got these portfolios, what we've done is given our lifestyles, we've adjusted our portfolios to suit us. And different households will have different priorities and different portfolios, but the portfolios will tend to be in equilibrium. We will have adjusted the right amount of, we've got the right amount of money, we have bought the furniture that we want, and we've got a television, and we've got a car and stuff like that. So we feel very much balanced. Now let's assume that the money supply increases by, say, 5%. This will work its way through the economy. The banks will get the 5% and they will lend it out to companies and households and so on, and eventually it'll come to the companies and the households, this extra 5%. Now there's more money in the economy and it's worked its way through the system, worked its way to the companies and to the households. But that will lead to an excess of money. So the portfolios are out of balance. The portfolios were in balance. Households had the right amount of money, the right amount of furniture, the right number of cars, the right number of gadgets in the house and so on. But now they've got an excess of money. So they need to dispose of the money to re-establish a balance in their portfolio. So they will spend the excess. And of course by spending the excess they create a demand for goods and services which will bid up the prices. And there's the linkage with inflation. So the increase in money, because of the upset to the balance, the portfolio balances, that leads to more expenditure, and more expenditure means prices will be bid upwards. Let's have a look at this. We got changes in the money supply leading to changes in inflation. Now, this is the extreme position here. So we have, let's say, a demand curve and a supply curve. I say it's the extreme position because you'll note here that the supply curve is vertical. For example, let's say the economy is at full employment. So the total supply in the economy is fixed. If it's fixed, it's a vertical line. Now, given the demand, then the price level will be P1. Now if the government puts in more money, there's an excess of cash in the system, portfolios are upset, so they will cause the demand for goods and services to increase. The demand will shift out to D, T plus 1, of course causing prices to rise. So there's an explanation for inflation through the portfolio reasoning. A less extreme case is when the supply curve has got some gradient. So less extreme because in this case when the demand curve shifts to the right, because portfolios now have an excess of cash and people are disposing of the cash, turning it into real goods and services. That means that the price is bid up from P1 to P2, but also more production might be called into position. So it may be that the economy can expand output to some extent. Now clearly I call them the extreme position and the less extreme position. The extreme position being one where the economy is at full employment and the increase in money can't go anywhere other than an increase in inflation. The less extreme case, the economy was not at full employment, there was capacity in the economy, prices are bid up because of the expansion of the money supply, and there is some adjustment in output. Supply moves from ST to ST1 and prices rise. Now, other criticisms. Well, we have the Fisher equation MV equals PT, and we've also got to the stage where delta M leads to delta P. That's when V and T are constants. Now, are V and T constants? This is another issue we need to look at. Perhaps V and T are not constants. Let's look at T. So we need T to be a constant. We need V to be a constant as well for the Fisher equation to give us our simple relationship between delta M to delta P. So is T a constant? Well, the classical economists assumed that all prices were flexible and that the economy would move to full employment automatically. When the economy is operating at full employment, the amount of transactions will be fixed at that level. So the classical economists believed that through flexibility in the markets, full employment would come about. But once the economy is at full employment, then that's the maximum amount that the economy can produce. In other words, T is constant. It can't be adjusted more than that. It's at full employment. So they believed that the capitalist system would move towards full employment automatically, providing markets were flexible, all markets were flexible, and it would move to full employment, which means T would be constant. It would be fixed by the full employment level. Full employment defines the capacity of the economy, and the number of transactions cannot exceed this level. So full employment means that T would be constant. The number of transactions would be constant at the full employment level. Now V, well, V is a constant. This is more difficult to see and to understand. Is V a constant really? In the long run, the velocity of circulation will settle down to some constant figure. But if you consider, let's say, the short run and the long run, in the short run, let's say that up and down curve we've got there, this one here, let's say that runs over the period of, let's say, a year. Well, around here, very low levels of money circulation. Around February, very little happening in the economy. February, end of January, January sales are over. Very little happening. February into March, very little happening. Then summer is coming, so people start to spend money. They start to book holidays and they start to buy equipment for the garden and so on. So it carries on increasing right throughout the summer, and then coming up to Christmas and the various festivals on the way to Christmas, and then on to the new year. So velocity is very high. Then after the new year it goes back down, and we're into January again and February and so on. So as you can see, the velocity of circulation of money is it's variable. It's not a constant. Of course, if you take a long run view, it's just an average of the short runs, and that would be a constant. It's like taking an average for anything. If we find a series of numbers that are following a particular pattern, we take an average, we just get a single figure. Now, monetarists argue that their view is long run. Keynesianism is short run. So the monetarists are long run economists. They believe in the long run. So just looking at what we've got here, if we take an average of the short run positions, we just get a long run, a fixed long run. So to the monetarists, V is a constant. So therefore, if the economy moves to full employment, T will be a constant. And if we average the short runs into the long run, we have another constant. We have V as a constant. So as a mathematical expression, the Fisher equation cannot be criticized, except perhaps that it's not really an equation at all. It's an identity. But as a tautological relationship, it's unassailable. The problem arises when we try to manipulate the expression to explain the price level. The Fisher equation is used to explain the relationship between the money supply and the price level by assuming that two of the variables, M and V, are constant. So it needs M and V to be constant, and we've seen the arguments that have been put forward in favour of M and V being a constant. M, P, beg your pardon. transactions and the velocity, so it'd be T and V. I'm sorry, not M and V. That's a mistake in the typo there. So it's T and V. The number of transactions are fixed at the full employment level. So T is a constant. Now, whether we get to full employment is debatable, or whether we've ever been at full employment, or what exactly full employment is. Economists constantly debate about the definition of full employment and so on. So T, not M as we've got on the slide here, T, if we did go to T, then that would be a constant. V, well, V is just the long run average of the short run variations that we saw in the diagram. So are they constant? In a slump period, an increase in the money supply may not be borrowed for investment purposes. Instead, the effect of this increase in the money supply is to depress the velocity of circulation of money. So, if it's a slump, then people don't want to invest. There's a slump in the economy, people are not making purchases, there's very little economic activity. So why would business people want to borrow money to make investments? They're not going to make a profit because there's little demand in the economy. So if the money supply is increased, then it will just simply reduce V, reduce the velocity of circulation of money. So the money supply increases, V could decrease, so that overall MV remains unchanged. So it could be that the money supply increases and V decreases. So in other words, there's no change. The longer the time period, the greater the chances that V is a constant. Obviously, over a longer time period, the economy goes through slumps and booms. So there's more of an argument to be made. In periods when there are unemployed resources, an increase in the money supply may attract those resources into production. So it could be that in this case, a change in M, an increase in the money supply, could lead to an increase in transactions because the economy was not at full employment. And therefore, there's no linkage with prices. So the Fisher equation does not explain inflation. It explains perhaps a change in economic activity, more output, less unemployment. Increase in M could lead to an increase in T. So you can see it's complex. Also, how is the money supply measured? We talk about delta M leading to delta P. So what is M? What is the money supply? There are different measures of the money supply. There's notes and coins in circulation, sometimes called M0. Notes and coins in circulation plus bank credit, the amount that the banks make. Notes and coins in circulation plus bank credit plus money held externally in foreign banks. Sterling, if in the case of the UK, might be held by banks outside of the UK. Dollars, in the American case, will be held by banks outside of America. The problem is, which definition of the money supply is correct for the Fisher equation to work? And it's difficult to answer that. So we've got delta M leads to delta P. That's the Fisher expression. And that's the one used by the monetarists. But we need to know what M is. Which definition suits? We've already noted that V may vary in the short run, the velocity of circulation. Think back to the diagram we had this up and down short run V. The point to note here is that the classical economists were concerned with the long run, and V is considered a constant in the long run. So the monetarists and the classical economists, they were only concerned with long run situations, not short run. So therefore V was a constant. In the equation, P represents the price of all goods, including work in progress and raw materials. And of course, what we want is to work out the inflation rate based on final goods and services, what we buy. We don't go to shops to buy raw materials or work in progress. We go to buy the final product, and that's what we're interested in. So we're not really that interested in intermediate goods, and that's a drawback of the equation. So in this session on the Fisher equation, we've looked at what the Fisher equation is. We've looked at how it was worked out, how a change in M leads to a change in P. We've looked at an explanation, two if you include the black box methodology, and we looked at the portfolio explanation offered by Friedman. Then we've looked at the criticisms of the relationship, and then we saw there were many criticisms of the relationship that we need to take into account. It would be wise to go back over this, because this explains how governments attempt to control inflation. There are other explanations and other ways in which inflation may be analysed and may be treated. The Keynesians, for example, had a much more sophisticated, a much more almost mechanistic way of dealing with inflation. There was one famous speech in the House of Commons in London in which the Chancellor at the time, who was a monetarist, was accused of being like a golfer playing golf but only using one club. You had a whole bag of clubs to pick from, but the golfer only used one club to play golf. In other words, the monetarists only use changes in the money supply. They use the money supply to solve inflation. They don't go for any other policy measures. They don't go for any other instruments of policy to try and solve inflation. The efficiency of the solution is really a matter of history, and it's up to economic historians to assess whether that period was successful or not. And I suppose in a sense it's too recent. Although it was back in the 1970s and 1980s, it's too recent for us to have really firm decisions and firm understanding of whether it was successful or not. That's all I'm going to deal with in this session, so let's leave it at that. It's a highly controversial area, and I suppose much of what I said may be disputed and so on, but that's one view of the Fisher equation, and that's all we're going to deal with here. I'm going to give you a reference which is very old, and it's unlikely you're ever going to find this book, but it's a wonderful read if you happen to fall across it in a second-hand bookshop or wherever. It's by Stewart. You can see it's 1967, so the chances of finding it, I appreciate, are just about zero, but it is well worth reading if you manage to get your hands on a copy. That's all I'm going to deal with, so say thank you for watching.